Energy Transition Now with David Linden.
Hello everyone again. You're listening to Energy Transition Now. I'm your host, David Linden, the head of Energy Transition for the Westwood Energy Group. In the last few series, we've been diving into technologies that are going to be key to unlocking the energy transition. That began with offshore wind and then was followed by hydrogen. Thank you to all the guests who took their time to share their views and to those of you who listened in. We now have over 10,000 downloads, so thank you to all of you. Please do continue to give us a good rating and share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. So today we kick off our latest mini-series focused on CCUS. CCUS is expected to be used to permanently remove CO2, typically from sectors that have more limited options available to decarbonize, but also to remove directly from the atmosphere as well. Technology's potential in tackling climate change has been championed by some. Development has lagged ambition. However, there now appears to be new momentum. So is this the CCUS moment we have been waiting for? To help us start to unpack things, I'm really pleased to welcome Toby Lockwood from the Clean Air Task Force as our first guest in this new series. Welcome to Energy Transition Now, Toby.
Thanks, David. Good to be here.
Perfect. Thank you. And thanks for taking the time to come on. Maybe just to get the ball rolling from your side, can you maybe just give us a minute on the Clean Air Task Force and your role in it?
Yes, the Clean Air Task Force is an NGO, an environmental NGO, which is really focused on pushing changes in both policies and technologies that we need to get to zero emission society at an affordable cost, whilst meeting energy needs of everyone. It's been around since 1996. It's originally set up in the US, and as you can tell from the name, its original focus was really more on toxic air pollutants from things like coal plants, and CATF did a lot of important work on that challenge and drove important policy change in the US. And then I think around the early 2000s, there was a shift towards looking at the next big problem, which was, of course, greenhouse gases and how we can meet our climate goals. I think the DNA of the organization is to be pragmatic, look at all options. So we have a diverse team of experts looking at a number of different technology areas, and carbon capture and storage, methane abatement, how to deliver the infrastructure need for renewables deployment. Some of these challenges that we've identified as really being critical roadblocks in the path to climate neutrality, which may not be being addressed so much by other organizations. And the organization expanded globally a few years ago. So I'm based in the UK and I work on both UK and EU policy here. And we have teams in several other regions around the world, but particularly in Europe. So my role as part of the carbon capture and storage program at CATF is to work on developing new analysis and materials which can assess the case for using carbon capture and storage. Yeah, I mean, we try to be as context dependent and as adaptable. Yeah, often different regions do need very different approaches because, you know, we often say the best policy is one that works, and policies that work are different in different places. In the EU and the UK, we have carbon tax. That's not the case nationally, at least in the US. So yeah, there's always a need to be adaptable, and yeah, US origins, but definitely a global organization these days.
Perfect. Yes, and I've enjoyed reading a lot of your materials that you've put out, I think, which is one of the reasons I definitely wanted to have you come on. So thank you. So maybe let's just start off with some of the basics around CCS itself, right? So there is, you know, at its most extreme level, you've got some people saying we don't need CCS. decarbonize or net zero. And then the flip side is, you look at all these different IPCC scenarios that are out there, and actually you need a lot of CCS. I mean, maybe just calling back to you first of all, the basics around why do we even need
CCS in your mind in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few ways to look at this, and as you said, it's often about an appeal to the numbers, to the kind of hard science that's been done on pathways to climate neutrality, to reduce CO2 emissions, and there's really pretty overwhelming evidence that carbon capture and storage, and in particular geological storage of large quantities of CO2, is going to need to be a part of that. You can see that, as you said, in the IPCC reports, the sixth assessment report, which came out, I think it was maybe 2 years ago now, which looks at abatement pathways, and they look at a large number of sort of modeling pathways, looking at different ways to reach different temperature targets. But if you look at pathways compatible with 1.5 degrees of warming, then you see across all those pathways a kind of median amount of CCS, which looks like around 7 billion tons of CO2 being stored per year by 2050. And over the period to 2100, which is the period they assess, there's over 700 billion tons and closer to 700 billion tons stored over that period. So that's a median amount. I mean, there's scenarios which have less. I think there's one that, I mean, often the publications on the IPCC reports look at the illustrative mitigation pathways, which they have a bit more evidence on, and you can see even in those that they all have a significant amount of CCS, apart from one scenario, which you could potentially seize upon, but it's really quite an outlier. And if you look a bit deeper into that scenario, you can see that it requires a massive reduction in energy consumption to 2050. So that's the kind of reality we're looking at, the kind of choice. And I think CATF would look at that scenario and think that's maybe not the greatest scenario for large parts of the world, and it's probably not very likely to actually out. So with a pragmatic hat on, I think we need to look at the message that this modelling is telling us, and that's that energy consumption is probably going to continue to grow, maybe remain stable at best, and CCS will need to be part of this. And you can see similar results from organisations like the International Energy Agency, who identify a need for 6 billion tonnes of CO2 captured and stored by 2050. That's in their net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. There's an organisation called DNV, the pathway to net zero as well, and they have 8 billion tonnes. So I think you can see a sort of consistent message that we can argue about the numbers. Hopefully we will need less CCS, I would say, but it looks like we may need on the order of billions of tonnes of CO2 being stored every year, as I'm sure we'll get to later in this conversation, where it depends how you measure it, but probably at around 30 or 40 million tonnes being stored.
Million, not billion, yeah.
Exactly. So there's a huge scale up required, and I think it's a bit of a no regrets action to get started with that now. So yeah, I think that's sort of the basic. But I mean, yeah, to get into why those numbers are so big, because I guess that's just saying it comes to the modelling isn't really enough. As you alluded to in the introduction, there are some sources of emission need CCS to decarbonise. One that's often cited is the cement sector, which produces, you hear a lot about hard to abate industries, and cement is one of the hardest to abate because a lot of its emissions are associated with CO2, which is driven off limestone into the process, and that's calcium carbonate. And so the CO2 really comes from that chemical process rather than any fossil fuel combustion. There is also fossil fuel combustion. It's about a third of the emissions at the moment. That's a sector which is really looking at CCS very seriously, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit more. There are other sectors, some chemical sectors and waste incineration, which certainly have a strong case for needing CCS as well. They have kind of these emissions which aren't associated with fossil fuels. Other applications for CO2 storage, which, as you mentioned, there's a lot of what we're seeing in these projections for meeting our warming goals comes from just pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. That could be via biomass, or it could be direct air capture, directly taking it out of the air. There's also just a question of, we have so many polluting sources today. Big power plants is a major one. Heavy industry, even when there are potentially alternatives, like you often hear about green hydrogen as an alternative to decarbonising some industries. Even when there are alternatives, can we roll them out fast enough to meet our climate goals, or do we need to have CCS kind of helping at the same time? It's really just about options on the table and tackling the problem with more than just renewable energy, because that may not be enough. But there's really so much locked in, so many assets which have just locked in emissions.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to break down some of that actually just in a little bit more in the sense. So one of the ways I look at it, I guess, a little bit is it's essentially we're starting to move towards more of what I think the IPCC calls the overshoot scenarios, right? The ones where you'd like to be on a perfect pathway downwards because everything's decarbonizing and it all looks fine, but essentially where the demand's still going up for fossil now, and that gives you on a trajectory essentially where you're going to overshoot the pathway you'd ideally like to be on before you then have to use things like CCS, etc., to get you down fast enough to a world, where parts per million look more sensible again from a CO2 perspective, at least. What was always interesting is that people talked about hard to abate sectors, but is it because it's the lowest cost option that these guys have, or there are no other options? You talked about alternatives, but ideally you want to do it in the cheapest way, and CCS doesn't happen overnight. It's infrastructure build, it's pipelines, and all those sorts of things need to be built. Is it really because there is nothing else and it's not happening fast enough, or is it essentially actually this is cost option that these guys should take because alternatives themselves are actually more expensive and not as good at doing the job of decarbonizing in the time frame that we need?
Yeah, there's a lot in there, but I think good points. There's, for some industries, lowest cost option. I mentioned cement. I mean, it's kind of the only option. I think there are other sectors where there are other options available, but CCS is lower cost. And I think it really depends a bit on by lower cost. Often the alternative cost is dependent on the availability of green hydrogen, large amounts of renewable energy. So that's often it's usually not a lower cost solution today. And that's why one of the other applications as you see in the modeling is as a route towards decarbonized fuels. So you can, instead of using renewable energy to produce green hydrogen, which is a great low carbon fuel, you can convert natural gas to hydrogen and store the CO2, and then it also produces an alternative low carbon fuel, and that's something we can do right now. So I think a lot of it is what's the lowest option now, the lowest cost option now, rather than, and of course, decarbonizing industries are going to have to make those assessments and look at whether they can potentially make a lower cost route available in 10 years. But I think it's important that we cut our emissions as fast as possible, and we look at solutions which can deliver at lowest cost today. So there is a little bit of a changing playing field as we build more renewable energy. But at the moment, it's fairly scarce. Green hydrogen is very scarce and very expensive. So that means CCS really becomes relevant in a large range of applications. And even in the power sector, I mean, you can look at the impressive cost reductions we have from solar and wind. It's a no-brainer to just roll those out. There's challenges associated with that, as I mentioned. We're looking at trying to improve infrastructure build out, which can help accelerate that process. But at the same time, if you look at decarbonising an entire electricity system, you do still have a need for other forms of energy that aren't wind and solar, don't depend on the weather. That could be energy storage, could be nuclear, which we also work on. Essentially, looking at the cost of decarbonising a power system is different from looking at the lowest cost way of generating electricity, and that lowest cost mix may include some CCS. So I guess I just use that to illustrate the point that it really depends. Talking about what's the lowest cost option really depends what your parameters are and what your criteria are.
And I guess it will depend on each country and each situation very much. It's I just raised it because cost seems to be a big discussion point certainly in politics and in the UK and other parts of the world right now. How much is this going to cost the end consumer, and how much will they feel it? And I remember seeing something on your website, I think some analysis you'd done, or maybe somebody else, and you'd republished it around, that there were individual plant costs that you saw, which looked like, oh, you're having to sort of, put carbon capture onto it, and it was going to raise the plant cost price by 60%, etc. But actually, what you were doing was achieving 50% reductions in emissions across the life cycle, and only a 1% increase in the cost of the end product itself. I can't remember the example off the top of my head. So that's a good illustration around, actually, yeah, it might look costly to the external eye, but actually when you get to the end consumer, that's achieved a lot for not an individually kind of costly price.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting conclusion that you see in decarbonisation of heavy industry. And that could be by CCS or other methods, but even if you potentially double the cost or add 50% to the cost of something like cement or steel, that cost increase becomes much less significant when you look at end products like a car or a building. And that analysis was done by SINTEF Research Institute in Norway. There's been similar studies done by a few other research groups, but it's kind of to illustrate the fact that we can maybe find ways of funding these decarbonisation technologies which don't, obviously society is still paying the same, but it's not so difficult to bear when it's potentially the consumer seeing a very small increase in the price of a fairly high cost end good. And we could also drive that through regulation on those sectors which require lower embedded carbon, for instance.
Yeah. No, I thought it was a fascinating bit of analysis because it highlighted the difference to some of the debates that we have around renewable electricity and the costs that people on their electricity bills versus how it sort of played through to other end products here for the consumer sees sells.
Yeah, I should say the reason for that is because there's so many other cost inputs
Yes.
into those final, the supply chains and the workforce and that kind of thing.
Great, thanks, Toby. So let's look at maybe where CCS is developing in the world. If you could give us a bit of a kind of insight as to where in the world that's happening and which regions are important.
Yeah, well, the USA has really been a front runner in developing the technologies that are used for carbon capture and storage. And a lot of that historically has been driven since as far back as the 1970s by enhanced oil recovery, which is a technology where CO2 is injected into depleted oil reservoirs to increase production. So it's not exactly the kind of CCS we want to see for climate purposes today, but it's helped develop a huge amount of know-how in CO2 storage and capture and developed a lot of CO2 infrastructure across the US. So there's a large number of projects in the US doing that, normally taking CO2 from sort of low cost, easy to capture sources. But more recently, we've seen a real shift in the US towards more climate driven projects, and that's driven by really pioneering legislation under the Inflation Reduction Act, which has increased the level of a tax credit you can receive for storing CO2. And the value of that credit is actually increased if you don't do it for enhanced oil recovery, but purely for the purposes of storage. And the tax credit's been around for a while, but under the Inflation Reduction Act, that's been increased significantly. And there's also additional provisions for building out CO2 transport and storage infrastructure under the Inflation and Jobs Act. So lots of policy incentives in place in the US, but that is, important deciding factor in whether it's a promising pathway in a particular region. But there's a lot of great geology in California and the Midwest, so we're seeing kind of developments around those regions. In the US, in Europe, North Sea has a lot of potential for CO2 storage, and that's really the centre of activity in Europe at the moment. There's been a couple of Norwegian projects that have been storing CO2, one of them since 1996, and that's because that is kind of for climate reasons, because there was a CO2 tax in Norway on oil and gas production, which really drove that. And we're seeing now a lot of interest all across Europe, which we'll maybe get onto later because that's my kind of focus. And that's particularly in the last couple of years. I'd say we've seen a huge number of policy announcements, both at national level and the EU level, which recognizing a role for CCS in meeting Europe's ambitious climate targets and dedicating funding towards specifically towards CCS for scaling it up. So other regions, there's worth noting, Japan last year announced a CCS roadmap which identified 7 kind of industrial cluster areas where they were interested in deploying CCS. There's a lot of challenges in Japan, particularly around storage, but definitely there's potential there, and it's something they've identified. They're looking at scaling up to 240 million tons of annual storage by 2050. Has done a lot. There's been a few projects kind of ticking away at various scales in China for many years, but I think in the last couple of years we've seen real concerted interest in developing kind of large scale commercial CCS projects, and we've seen some kind of global oil players getting involved in developing offshore, like large scale offshore storage projects in China. I think as kind of notable landmarks, there was the first 1 million ton per year scale project in China kicked off last year, and they started their first offshore CO2 storage project. So those are really, I guess the other 2 major regions to mention, the Middle East, where in particular Saudi Arabia has set some very ambitious targets for scaling up CCS. They are looking at, off the top of my head, I think 9 million tons of annual storage at their Jubail industrial hub on the East Coast in the short term, and in the long term they're looking at 45 million tons per year. There's also a lot of potential in Southeast Asia, a lot of activity there around both depleted gas reservoirs and dedicated CO2 storage sites. There's a few regions leading the way and gathering momentum in many other parts of the world.
That was a very nice summary. Thank you. I mean, it sounds like essentially the US has led the way, Europe is following, and other regions are putting plans in place, but they're maybe not quite there yet in the same way that you've seen other regions get there. Do you see this being led essentially? I mean, certainly outside of, let's say, Europe and even in Europe, but is this an oil and gas player kind of driven market? And I asked that simply because you mentioned briefly just on China, it's a couple of oil and gas players have come in and looking to develop something there. Is that essentially the group of companies that's driving this as well?
Yeah, as I said that, I kind of thought there's a lot of unpacking to be done there. I mean, it's true that geological storage is something which requires a lot of expertise in dealing with what they call the subsurface. It's very specialized, and it is today largely oil and gas companies who have both the financial resources and the expertise to develop those storage sites. Not exclusively. I mean, you see sites developed by research institutes as well, and there are kind of engineering companies who have that expertise who can provide that service if companies are willing to pay. But oil and gas companies are definitely involved in a large number of projects on the storage side, and it's normally requires, and sometimes they can use their own emissions. A lot of early projects are really simply just taking CO2 out of natural gas. So the ones I mentioned in Norway, situations where you have natural gas coming out of the ground that's contaminated with CO2, and they have to remove that to make that natural gas saleable. So these companies have been for years removing CO2 and just venting it. So just take something like a CO2 tax to force them to return it to the ground, and that's a situation where an oil and gas company is obviously dealing with the entire thing. But as we look to use CCS more to decarbonize heavy industries and other sectors, obviously it involves a partnership between several companies. There may be a company that deals with CO2 transport by pipeline if the industry isn't right next to the storage site. So you often see consortiums of several companies dealing with different parts, and you may have a dedicated company which comes in to do the CO2 capture as well, which is the separation process.
Yeah, so there's actually there's one thing often people forget, I find, in the CCS discussion is there's a lot of different companies needed across the value chain. We often talk about the storage side, and as you rightly said, it's the oil and gas players who've got the expertise and the money to do that effectively. But the whole value chain has a whole range of different players typically involved, especially on the capture side, because obviously there are different technologies involved as well that can make that work.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly interested in promoting a more diverse set of players involved in CO2 storage as well, and it'd be great to have a competitive space where it's not just oil and gas players, but also I think it's important not to see their involvement, the involvement of those companies as a big negative, as if they're kind of, leading the dance. These are companies which are responsible for polluting fossil fuels, and it's good that they use their expertise and their resources to do something about that problem and to address that. And that's where a lot of policies are looking as well at the moment, as I'm sure we'll get to.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I certainly couldn't agree more on that one. Okay, so you're absolutely right. So let's shift maybe to a bit of a deep dive on the EU specifically. As you say, that's one of your core areas of expertise as well, and something you've been looking at, and following closely, should we say, from behind the US. Could you maybe just give us a bit of a rundown around what's happening with EU policy? How's that evolved to sort of bring CCS into the fold?
Yeah, so obviously you have the member state policy and EU policy, and that's not always exactly the same. But to focus on the EU, there's been some really significant developments early this year. First of all, the EU published an industrial carbon management strategy, which is really laying out a set of a kind of legislative program for how to scale up both carbon capture and storage and carbon capture and utilization, which is where you turn the CO2 into other products. And it sets some quite ambitious targets for scaling up that technology. And those were really tied to a communication they released at the same time on the EU's climate targets for 2040, which are based on a lot of internal European Commission modelling. So long story short, the communication on carbon management targets 250 million tons per year of CO2 storage by 2040, and getting towards 2050, that's accompanied also by a very large amount of carbon capture and utilization. I think another 200 million tons roughly. A number of proposed legislations were put forward to bring that about. Things like looking at a regulatory framework for CO2 transport, mapping geological storage potential across the region, possible ways of funding more projects. But it really is more of a kind of strategic goal, and we'll see that will have more teeth as it turns into kind of legislation over the course of the next commission. But a really important piece of legislation that was finalised at around the same time is the Net Zero Industry Act, which, it's kind of headline focus of that act is to promote the development of clean energy technologies domestically in the EU, one of which can be CCS, but obviously renewables and electrolyzers and all kinds of other things. But an important part of that act for CCS was it also set a binding target on CO2 storage capacity for 2030 of 50 million tons per year. So that kind of has more teeth than the strategy, which was an important landmark statement by the Commission, but it's really the Net Zero Industry Act, which we might see immediately starting to drive investment. And the interesting thing about that 50 million ton target is that it was placed as an obligation on oil and gas producers. So in proportion to your share of oil and gas produced between 2020 and 2023, you have to deliver a fraction of that 50 million tons, or you can exchange that obligation. You could procure capacity from another entity that's able to deliver that. If for instance, the certain oil and gas producer wasn't in a position to develop seed storage themselves, there's potential for coming to other commercial agreements on that. So there were a lot of other provisions in the Net Zero Industry Act which should accelerate CCS deployment, things around faster permitting. There are requirements around setting up on sort of better reporting from member states, so they have to say what they're doing on CCS and how many projects are developing, and if they're not choosing to do CCS, what else they're doing to decarbonize heavy industry and things like that. So it's a really important piece of legislation. We worked a lot on getting both those over the line, and we think it's really valuable to kind of harness the resources and expertise, as I said, of these big oil and gas producers. I mean, the interesting thing is that it's really focused on EU production, and EU production is not really that significant. Most of the oil and gas consumed in the EU is actually from other places, like Norway.
So it doesn't encompass Norway within that, even though Norway is officially in the European Economic Community as such.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's really targeted at. I mean, Norway is developing a lot of CO2 storage, and there's an expectation that CO2 will be exported from the EU, particularly to Norway. It's much more difficult to export to the UK because of Brexit. But the Norway's there as a kind of willing partner to accept EU CO2. But I think the idea of the Net Zero Industry Act, which we support, is to also promote CO2 storage in the EU, because it is much cheaper if you have CO2 storage closer to home. And I think we'll need all the storage we can get. So, and there are opportunities within the core EU member states, particularly Netherlands, Denmark, which have North Sea storage like Norway and UK, but also there's a pretty significant project being developed by Italy in the Adriatic. A lot of these are offshore projects, I should say, for a number of reasons.
No, it's fascinating simply because I think the EU was a little lukewarm on CCS for a long time, relative long time, and it looked like the UK was driving ahead, but individual member states, as you say, like Denmark and Netherlands, really started to pick up and develop the first projects. Essentially, I mean, but before the UK, and obviously Norway was first, but there was some real development. Do you see this? Because you mentioned things like regulatory frameworks and funding and those things. Is essentially what the EU's proposing a little more similar to the way that the UK system works? So if I think about it in my head, right, the US simplistically is less regulation heavy, more financial incentive heavy. UK is very regulation driven in some respects, with obviously some financial incentives to back it up. But it's not like here's a tax break, go and make it happen. The models have evolved slightly differently. What's the EU one starting to look like?
If you put it in terms of carrots and sticks, as people often like to, there's certainly a lot of stick in the EU compared to the US. There's this obligation on the oil and gas producers, but the big driver is really the price on carbon, and there's a lot of emitting industries which they're looking down the face of a phase out of free allowances, which has so far kind of protected them from the carbon price. And increasing carbon prices, last year we saw the carbon price go up to 100 euros per ton. So if you're a cement company, then you need to find a way around that. So they're looking to develop projects, and it's great that we now hopefully have oil and gas producers getting a bit more, speeding up a bit on making the storage sites, which can go together to make a value chain there. But there are carrots from the EU as well. There's something called the Innovation Fund, which takes proceeds from the ETS and puts it into decarbonisation projects, innovative decarbonisation projects, and a lot of that money in the large scale project category is going to CCS at the moment. A lot of it's a cement projects. In fact, I think there's about, depending how you count it, maybe about 15 CCS projects in that over various rounds of funding there. But that said, the real kind of money for deployment, which we think is certainly important to have on the table at this stage of any industry, we saw in renewables as well. At the beginning, to get an industry going, you do need to kickstart it with some subsidies. The way the EU works is that that's really coming at the member state level, and we're increasingly seeing that. The Netherlands was really a pioneer in having a funding system which covers all kinds of, like the Innovation Fund, it covers all kinds of, it's a pot of funding called the SD++, which can go to all kinds of decarbonisation projects, but a lot of it is going to CCS projects because they do actually deliver big cuts at competitive prices. So that's interesting to see. And we have the first final investment decision on a new CCS project in the EU was the one associated with the Port of Rotterdam, called the Portos project. And in Denmark, has also announced a significant amount of project funding. So that's more of a national thing. And in the UK, there's also a lot of funding on the table. We saw £20 billion announced in the budget before last, I think, which will go towards a set of very carefully thought out kind of what they call business models, which essentially subsidy systems for various types of CCS projects. I think maybe some headline things to say about this is that the reason for the shift in momentum globally, and particularly in Europe, I think, is climate targets, net zero by 2050. You often hear that when there were targets, even sort of 80% decarbonisation, everyone thought they could be in the 20%. There are lots of industries that were like, oh, well, we're really hard to abate, so we'll be protected from those cuts. But when it comes really about getting to net zero, I think governments across Europe and across the world are seeing that you kind of need CCS to make it work. And that's why there had to be a complete change of heart. And you see that most dramatically in Denmark, where CCS used to be against the law. Yeah. And then they kind of looked at the numbers and, looked at the net zero numbers, climate arithmetic, and realized they needed to do a U-turn on that. And we're seeing that in Germany as well. Germany released a carbon management strategy or a kind of preview of it, I think, earlier this year. And again, they've had to come back to technology which was dismissed about 10 years ago. So a lot of countries moving. France, another one, hasn't done the same kind of U-turn, but definitely is released a carbon management strategy as well, and recognises a role for technology. So a big shift, and I think it's really brought about by looking at those kind of uncompromising net zero goals.
No, thank you. No, that's really interesting. I mean, I completely agree with you. I remember, looking at CCS not too long ago and thinking, good luck in many countries. And actually, there's been such a sea change of mentality around CCS from governments that's shown, the opportunity. But of course, there's still the challenge of delivery, right? And as you kind of, noting there's the subsidy side of things, but there's also questions around the long-term business case. So places like the UK, as an example, are saying, here's our initial set of projects are going to be subsidized, but then we want a free market. No subsidy, nothing. Maybe a carbon price, but I don't know where the carbon price is going to be. Can you really build a business case on that? So maybe just to round things off right at the end. I mean, what's the biggest challenge in your mind to ensure that CCS takes off? Because you've got good policy coming along the way, or maybe your argument is it's not good policy, but we'll see. But what's the one thing in the EU, let's just say, that's needed to really now accelerate it from here's a nice strategy, how do we make it happen?
Yeah, great question. There are still challenges for sure. I think the EU ambitions do depend a lot on member states coming forward with funding. Just funding through this innovation fund isn't going to be enough. You get a project, here and there. You can't build kind of large-scale shared infrastructure based on kind of piecemeal announcements for one project in Greece, one project in south of France or something. It's really requires member states to come forward with funding approaches which can support the development of shared CO2 infrastructure. So that could mean pipelines with enough, or shipping, as a solution that a lot of projects looking at the moment, as a kind of easier fix is to ship the CO2 to storage sites in Norway or something. But to make any of that happen, you really need a kind of critical mass of projects which have a business case in one region, which can make it worthwhile to build infrastructure, and that gets the cost down for everyone. If you just have projects here and there building their own infrastructure, small scale stuff, then you get very high unit costs. You get much higher unit costs of abatement. So it's important to work together. It's important to find business models which encourage working together. The UK has looked at that really closely and is kind of funding very much on a regional level. I think we'll see more of that in other European countries, but it is a policy challenge. So I think infrastructure is the key. The EU can do a lot to pave the way there. It's working on things like standardizing CO2 specifications, so all the infrastructure is compatible. It's working on standardizing regulation and in terms of how much you can charge for and who can access this infrastructure. But I think ultimately it comes down to finding a way, particularly to build infrastructure ahead of demand. We need storage development in particular to kind of get off the fence, and hopefully the Net Zero Industry Act will help with this. Stop waiting for sure thing contracts with carbon capture plants to go ahead and invest, but to really just invest in the knowledge that there is going to be demand for CO2 storage. All the numbers are saying, and the political direction is there's going to be big demand for CO2 storage. I think CO2 storage developers really need to get going. I think there's a number of things that you can do to help with that, and it's already done some of it.
Yeah, I mean, we also look at hydrogen quite a bit in the last series. We asked, I think, what's the most important thing to each of the folks, and one of them said supply, the other one said infrastructure, and the other one said demand. I think it's a question of where you sit and what you're trying to achieve and how you're trying to do it. And I completely get your point around infrastructure and then demand and those things. It sounds quite similar, right? It's the same kind of, I hate to use it, chicken and egg in some respects problem though, but that's ultimately the core challenge with all of this is ensuring that there is, well, it's not necessarily a lack of supply, but plugging that supply into an infrastructure that then reaches a demand, a storage site in a cost-effective way is ultimately the only way you're going to get this done.
Yeah, I mean, we hear a lot about chicken and egg and CCS as well, and I think that the storage obligation, development obligation, was an attempt to to break that cycle, get storage developed, also fund capture, and have it all come together. And hopefully that will work. So far the only place we've seen the cycle really broken in Europe is Norway, which just decided to just put up money to fund a capture project and a storage project. And the clever thing there is that the storage project also has lots of spare capacity that it can use to help other parts of Europe decarbonize. So it's really a clever move to kind of fund that one kind of anchor project, a seed project, which justifies CO2 storage, but also to have spare capacity that's allowed other players like plants in Denmark and Netherlands to feed into that same storage site. So there's a bunch of ways you can approach this. I think we do need to make decarbonized industry have a business case in the long term, and as you said, the carbon price could maybe do that. It's expected to, it has to, the only way is up for the carbon price, but there are maybe, to come back to something we were talking about at the beginning, an interesting way to do that, maybe a more effective way to drive change alongside that would be to have things like low carbon product standards, and require a certain percentage of decarbonized cement on the market, require buyers to purchase a certain percentage of decarbonized cement, and that could increase over time. Or you could have things like carbon take back obligation, which is again an obligation on hydrocarbon producers to store a growing percentage of the carbon they produce. So I think it's interesting to look not just at carbon price, but at kind of regulatory drivers which can drive a small amount of high abatement action, like not wait. So we don't have to wait for the carbon price to get to 200 euros per ton before everyone starts investing, but we invest in a bit of the high cost technologies, we know the higher cost technologies, so that we know we're going to need today, and have that as a kind of ramping proportion. That's the kind of policy approach I think we should be looking at in terms of the business model.
All right, Toby, thank you so much for that. I think we have reached the end of our allotted time. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and for giving us such a generous amount of your time. I think there's a hell of a lot going on in CCS, and many different ways you can look at it, but certainly there's a lot still to do in the EU despite the recent momentum, and it's exciting to see in which direction it's going to be going. So thank you, Toby.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. And thanks everyone else for listening as well. Hope you enjoyed it. Please make sure you subscribe, give us a good rating, and share with your friends. Talk to you next time.